Hello, welcome to Tenon Tech. I'm your instructor Clark, and today we're going to learn about designing timber frames using the 3D CAD program Sketchup. This is part 2 of a 5-part series where I introduce you to the timber framing extensions to design mortise and tenon joinery.
Nice and slow.
Welcome back. What we're going to talk about today are the timber framing extensions. This is some software that I wrote to customize SketchUp for doing timber frame joinery design. I first wrote this software back when I was running my own timber framing shop, and it reflects how I do my joinery and how I manage my shop. So I guess in a way you could say that the software is somewhat opinionated because it reflects my style. You'll need to decide for yourself if this is going to work for you and how you like to do things, but I hope you'll find this useful. The first thing we need to do is install the extensions. Just choose extensions from the main menu here, go to the extension warehouse, and once the search box comes up, start typing timber framing. You may get several results here. The tile you want is the one with the little blue icon on it. Click that. You'll see my name here, this preview, and just hit the install button. There'll be a warning. Go ahead and say yes. And once it's been installed, you can click OK. Now, if you're upgrading from a previous version of the timber framing extensions, you're going to need to reboot or restart SketchUp at this point. To make sure you've got it installed correctly, go hit Extensions, and you should see timber framing appear here in this list. And if you go to the About window, you should see that it's Timber Framing Extensions version 3. First, I just want to give you a preview of how the extensions work. Let me go to the bare frame view of my model here. I'm just going to right-click on a timber and say Make Shop Drawings. What will happen is all 4 sides of the timber will be displayed with all the joinery on it, and you'll be prompted to save this to a folder someplace, to save this to a file. It should automatically fill in the name of the timber as the name of the SketchUp file. And notice that it's put me in a folder called Shop Drawings. I suggest that you do this, that you put all your shop drawings into their own folder, and then you hit Save. So when you're all done, you'll end up with a SketchUp file for every timber in your model. And eventually these are going to be sent to layout. So what I just showed you was a preview. I just wanted you to show you where we're heading, but that was starting with a model that was already completed with all the joinery in it. What I'm going to do now is make a new model from scratch. We'll start with this template. And the first thing I'll do is get rid of the human figure that was put on there. SketchUp puts that on there by default just to give you some sense of scale. And now I'm going to lay out some grid lines on the ground. I'll be using the tape measure tool, which lets you make chalk lines. Just using the hotkey for that. And if you click on one of the axes, it'll automatically create a chalk line there. And then I'm just going to drag over, type 12 feet, and 12 feet, and 12 feet. And in the other direction, I'm going to go 11 feet and 11 feet. So now I've got a grid line on the ground, which is going to show me my post locations. The next thing I'm going to do is grab a timber from a component library. A component library is nothing more than a folder with a bunch of SketchUp files in it. It can be located anywhere you want. And the one I'm going to use here is called FS Timbers for full-size timbers. This is a library I've built up over the years. It's not nominal timbers, so the timbers are all a full 10 by 10 or 8 by 8. And it's not square ruled either. It doesn't have any of those reductions in it. So it's a very simple model, simple style of joinery. I think it's really good for beginners who are learning how to use SketchUp, and let's not confuse ourselves with some of those other details just yet. If you go to my webpage and the SketchUp resources there, you can find a copy of this library. You're welcome to use that as a starting point. But again, this reflects my own style of joinery, my own way of doing things. So by all means, download it, use it as a guide or a starting point. But you're going to want to develop your own library with your own joinery in it that reflects your own way of doing things. So I'll start out by looking for a particular timber in my collection here. I'm going to look for a post with a 12-12 rafter foot. This is for the queen post cabin that we've been looking at in the previous examples. See, I'm going to snap it to that grid line, and now I'm going to make a copy of it. I do that by using the Move tool and holding down the Control key. That'll leave the original behind and make a copy. Now, you remember that we installed the Rotate 90 plugin in the previous video. I'm going to make use of that now. I've got that mapped to a function key, a hotkey. That's the F5 in my case. I'm going to hit that twice to rotate that timber 90 degrees 2 times, and now I'm going to snap it into place here on the grid on the ground. And the next timber I want is a tie beam, a 10 by 12, and I'll grab that and pull it out. Once again, I'll use that F5 key, the rotate 90 around blue, to put it oriented the way I want it. And I'm going to zoom in on it and pay attention to where I'm grabbing it. I'm grabbing it here at the place where it's going to intersect with the post, at the edge of the housing. So I click there to pick it up. And I'm not going to worry about the height just yet. I'm just going to get it against that post. Now, as is normally going to be the case, it's not the right length. So the thing we need to do next is to stretch it. Let's talk about how we want to stretch a timber. If I take a zoom in on this timber and use the tape measure tool, I can see that the tenon is 9 inches long. If I stretch the timber, I don't want the tenon to change. I just want the overall length of the timber to change. And if I use the built-in scale tool that's built into Sketchup, you might think that this kind of a movement here is going to give me the result that I want. But look what happens when I use the tape measure again. The tenon stretched as well as the timber, and that's not the desired behavior. Because of this, I wrote my own tool. It's called the stretch tool. Let me put this back the way it was. And that's built into the timber framing Ruby, so you've already got it. And I mapped that to the S hotkey instead of the scale tool, because I never use the scale tool because it does that distortion I was just showing you. So if I hit S for stretch, the cursor changes to this little target. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab it by the edge here, that same edge that's going to meet up with the side of the post. And now when I stretch it and go back to the tape measure tool, you can see that the tenon remained at 9 inches. Let me just stretch it now to the actual place. I can just hover anywhere on this edge and it's going to snap to that location. What that tool is actually doing behind the scenes, let me make a copy of this so I can show you, is that it's editing the whole timber, grabbing everything on one end, and then moving everything that we highlighted. That's what the stretch tool does automatically for you. It saves you from having to go in and edit the timber like this. Oh, notice that the timber in the background also moved along with. That's because this is a component, and when you change one, you change them all. Okay, we're not going to need this anymore. I'll delete that. And next, let's move this guy up to the correct height. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to start by putting it on the ground, and then I'll just move the top up so that the top is, say, 10 feet. Let's go 9 feet. 9 feet off the ground. Clearly then the posts are at the wrong height. Let's get them up to, say, 12 feet. I'm just going to draw another chalk line, just hovering in the air at 12 feet. And then I'll use my stretch tool again to bring it right up to that height. And I won't need that line anymore. Let's put in a post with a tenon. I want a 10 by 10 with a tenon. I'm going to make sure I've grabbed it by the middle, and then I'll snap it to that center. And you can see that the tenon's oriented the wrong way, so I'll use that rotate 90 key to rotate it 90 degrees. I've got X-ray mode mapped to the Alt-X key. I can use that to sort of take a sneak peek inside and see what's going on. Okay, I like that. And now let's move on to the rafters. Principal rafter, 1212. And I'll grab it by this corner because I know that's where I'm going to want to snap it onto the post. And then I'll make a copy using Control-M. Bring it over here. I'm going to hit F5 twice to rotate that 90 degrees and put it on that post. Now I'm going to stretch it using the stretch tool. Remember that if you move one or change one, you change them all. So I'm going to bring it right to, well, let me just go here for now. Now you can see I've got two tenons. I'm only going to want tenons on one. So I'm going to double click and delete the tenon on one. But if you've been paying attention, you can guess what's going to happen, because this is a component. If I change one, I'll change them all. I'll change them both. And I don't want that to happen. I only want to remove the tenon from one. So the first thing I need to do is right-click on one of them and say Make Unique. And now these guys are no longer siblings. One's distinct from the other. And if I delete the tenon, it'll delete it from the one, but not from the other. Now I can stretch it back to the place that I want it, which is going to be here, and I'll stretch this one back to here. And now I've got the open tenon or tongue and fork up here at the top. I'm going to throw in some knee braces, a KB30, knee brace 30. You can see that that's oriented wrong. I'm going to hit the F5 key to rotate that 90 degrees, or whatever hotkey you mapped it to. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's some little handles that I built into this component that lets me kind of snap it right into that corner. I'm going to make another copy. This time I'm going to take a mirror image. I don't want to rotate 90 because I want to keep the tenons on the same side. So instead I'm going to take a mirror image of this, and that would have been mirror along the blue, I believe. I've got that mapped to another hotkey, and now I can rotate 90 degrees. And now I should have all the tenons on the same side. And I'll make a copy of that, and that one goes here. What else do we need? Let's put some queen posts in there. I know, it's not really a queen post truss, but that's just sort of the queen post position on this frame, if that's how you want to look at it. But the point isn't to teach you timber frame engineering, it's to teach you how to use SketchUp. I'm going to put it in the center to start with, and then I'm going to move it over 4 feet, and then I'll make a copy of that and move that one over 8 feet, and that should have them centered. They're a little too tall, but I'll fix that in a second. Next I'm going to put a collar tie in there. Here's a collar tie for a 12-12 roof, also an 8x10. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. I'm going to pick it up by this corner, and I'm just going to kind of touch it into the roof here. I'm just going to slide down the roof. Now here's another trick. I've already got it moving in this direction. If I press and hold the shift key, it'll lock onto that direction. It really doesn't matter where I keep my mouse. I'm going to put it, I think I'm going to put it about here. How tall is that? I'm just going to measure it quick. 7.5. Let me get it up to 7.6. So again, I'm using that. Well, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to snap it down here. Then I'll move it left to right to get this joint lined up. And then I'll use the stretch tool. Notice where I'm grabbing it to get this other end lined up. Now it doesn't look like my queen posts are going to work where I got them. Let me just adjust that a little bit. I'm going to come in, let's see, maybe 6 inches on both of these. And now they're too long, and I'm just going to stretch them down to get them where I want them. There we have it. We need knee braces up there. Just copying the ones I already have that are already oriented the way I want them. And there we have it. There's bent one. Now, along the way here, I'll probably save this. Let's just put it in a junk folder. And along the way here, I might want to be testing to see if the joinery is working the way I expect it to. So at any point, I can just right-click on a timber and say Make Shop Drawings. And again, it's prompting me to save it to a particular location, but I'm not doing that. I'm just doing a preview here, and I'm just looking to see if it looks right. Yeah, it's got the knee brace mortise in it where I expected. I'll just hit the escape key and we'll go back to the model. Or if I was going to look at this tie beam, I'm expecting 1, 2, 3, 4 knee brace mortises and that center mortise from the post. If I say Make Shop Drawings, here's 1, 2, 3, 4 knee braces. The center mortise from the post. Oh, and I forgot the bottoms of the queen posts are up there too. Again, we'll just hit escape and go back to the main model. So there's bent one. I'm just going to select all of this. Note that when I swipe from right to left, it will select everything that touches the box, whereas if you go from left to right, only those things that are completely inside it. I don't want to get the chalk lines on the ground, so I'm doing it this way. I'm going to pick this up by grabbing it on the center this time, using M with the control key to move it. Snap that there, and do it again. Then on this last one, I'm going to grab it by the outside so that so I can stick it there. Now here the braces are on the wrong side, so what I'm going to do is temporarily make a group, use that rotate 90 key to flip it around, and then explode the group. Now you may be wondering why I don't leave these bends connected, and that's because the automated joinery, the make shop drawings, only works if the timbers are at the top level of the model. They can't be buried inside other components or groups. I'm not going to go ahead and build out this whole frame, but I'll put in a few more pieces here just so you can see how it goes. Next thing I'm going to do is grab a girt with one tenon and one spline. And we'll stick that. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees twice. I'm going to attach it here, and I'm going to raise it up off the ground 8 feet. And then I'm going to stretch it. And then I'm going to grab a tenon, a girt with 2 splines. I'm going to put that here. I'm going to lock it onto the blue axis by using the shift key. Now I can move my mouse anywhere I want, and I'll move it over here to line it up with this girt. And again, I'll use the stretch tool. And finally, another one with 1 tenon and 1 spline. Hang on. And the stretch tool. Now at this point I could add the knee braces and then select the braces and these girts and copy them over to the other side. Or I could pull components out of my library again and insert those. But instead I'm going to start from scratch and show you how you make a timber from scratch so that you can start building up your own library. I'm going to start by using the rectangle tool, that's R. And I'm just going to draw a box on the ground, and then I'm going to type its actual dimension, 8,8. Now I'll use the push-pull tool, and I'm just going to extend it up. And I really don't care the actual length. I'm just going to type 8 feet just to get something. We'll be stretching it later. And now, I think you remember from the last video, if I try to move this now, I'm only going to get part of the timber, and that's because this is still loose geometry. It's just edges and faces. So the first thing I want to do is collect all those into a component. And I can either select them this way, or I can triple click, which selects everything that's touching. Then right click and make component. I'm just going to call this my girt. And next I'm going to rotate it down into the horizontal position, and then I'll use the rotate 90 to get it oriented left and right. So there's the basic timber, but now I need to add some joinery to it. Now this is a key point. A timber needs to be a component at the top level of the model, and a joint needs to be a subcomponent of the timber. To get started here, I'm going to double click to get inside of the timber joint, and now I'm going to make the joint. Remember, this was a fully housed tenon, so I'm going to use the push-pull tool to create the housing first. If I use the control key, I'll leave that original face behind. I'm going to type 1 to make that 1 inches deep. There's my housing, and now I'm going to make the tenon. I'm just going to make a copy of this line 3 inches over, and this one 2 inches over, and use the push-pull tool to pull out a tenon 5 inches long. So I'm still inside the timber component, and I need to make this tenon into a subcomponent of that timber. So I'm going to select all those parts. I'm going to right-click and say Make Component. I can just leave the default definition name there. I can name it if I want. But these next things are really important. I need to say Glue to Any, and I need to set the component axes. Now the component axes is going to tell me where this joint is supposed to cut into the face of the other timber. So you can see that right now it's out at the tip of the tenon. That's not what I want. I want it to be back here on the housing line. That's where it's going to interface with the post or whatever the other timber is that I'm going to cut. So I'm choosing 3 points on the joint that correspond to the face of the timber I'm going to cut into. Make sure that replace selection with component is selected and hit create. Now I've got the joint in the correct situation here where it is a subcomponent of the timber. So again, here's the timber at the top level of the model. I double click on it, I'm inside the timber, and now here is the joint component. Now to make this an actual joint that's going to get recognized by the timber framing extensions, you need to right click on it and say create joint. Now when the extensions see one of these in your timber, it's going to recognize that that's a joint that should be turned inside out and made into a mortise. You may have noticed that some color coding happened here. The darker the color, the deeper that part of the mortise. Next, I need to add some peg holes. I'm just going to zoom in here, and I'm going to use the peg hole tool that's built into the timber framing extensions. You can either select it from the menu or map it to a hotkey. I've got it mapped to the O key. O is normally orbit, but I never use it for that. I always use my mouse button for that. Don't move too fast with the peg hole tool. It can sometimes lose track of where you are, but what you do is you click on a known location, then move on to the face of the tenon and type the distance that you wanted, 2, 2. And then I'll come up the same from the bottom, 2, 2. Now you can also make pegs manually if you want to just get inside the timber component. Use the circle tool, draw that, right click on it and say create peg. But I think you'll find that using the peg hole tool is much faster. So here we are. We've got the joint created. It's time to test it. To test that the joint works correctly, I just need to interface it with another timber. I'm just going to choose this post here, and I don't really care where it is. What I'm looking for is to make sure that it cuts a mortise like I expect. So I've got it aligned correctly with the housing up against the post here, and I'm just going to right click on the post and say make shop drawings. Now the extensions are expecting us to save this, but all we're doing at this point is doing the preview. And look, here it is. There's that housing and the mortise. Here's a profile of it, and here's a profile of it. So it looks like it worked correctly. So I'm not going to save this. This was just a test to check that I've created my joint correctly. So I'm just going to hit escape, and we'll end up back in the model. That was a really simple example. Let me try something a little more complicated. Let's maybe do one of these. Let's do this collar tie joint. I'll just delete this, and let's see if we can't make that one from scratch. I'll start out by drawing the timber. That's going to be an 8 by 10 this time. 8, 10. And we'll just push-pull that out some length. I don't really care what. Triple click it to select everything. Make a component. My collar. I'm going to roll it down so that it's horizontal. And I'm just going to kind of set it up here in place. Note that I really didn't care about the length, because now I'm going to trim it to length by double clicking on it and then just sort of tracing along that intersection. Then I'll use the push-pull tool to sweep away all that excess. And I'll do the same at this end. Now the rafter's kind of in my way, so what I'm going to do is take advantage of the fact that if you make a copy of the component and change one, you'll change them all. Watch what happens when I edit this and push this away. It also changed this one. So it might be convenient for me to work out here in empty space a little ways away from the model, so I'm not being so that the rest of the model isn't interfering with me. So there's my timber component, my collar, and next I'm going to make a housing. That's going to be 1 inch deep. I use the control key to make it leave the original behind, and I'll type 1 for 1 inch. And you can see there's some issues right away. Obviously this isn't correct, but I can just draw this line and use the push-pull tool to sweep all that away. And then if we go back to the thing that I'm trying to make, this collar tie, you can see I've got this little reveal here. So let me put that in there. Well, first let me figure out how I wanted that to be. Looks like that's 12 inches long. So let's do that on ours. I'm just going to use the tape measure tool, measure down 12 inches. That's where it is. And I can use the push-pull tool to get back to that point. I'll use the line tool to draw this line, and then we can just sweep all that away. And I don't need that little mark left behind by the tape measure tool. I'll delete that. So there's the housing, and now I need the tenon. Like before, I'll just make copies of these lines. We'll go 3 inches in, and then 2 inches in, and push-pull out a tenon, say 4 inches. Again, that just made everything perpendicular to that face, and we got this stuff up here that we don't need anymore. A couple ways I could do this. I could use the tape measure tool and just draw a chalk line over there, and then trace along that with my line tool, and use the push-pull tool to sweep all that away. I no longer need the chalk line, and this is an extra line that I don't need. So there's my tenon, and I need to turn it into a subcomponent. I want to select just the tenon. I don't want to get any of this stuff. So I'm going to kind of orient my view here so that I can easily select just the pieces that I want to be the tenon. Looks like I've got it. So right click, make component, glue to any, set the component axes. Now in this case, it's going to be on this angle. See how that plane that I've defined, that second gray plane, corresponds with the underside of the rafter that it's going to be cutting into. Make sure this is set and hit create. Right click, create joint, and now it's time for peg holes. Use the peg hole tool. I'm going to come up 2,2 and 6,2. And now we test it. I'm going to grab it here because that's what's going to interface with the rest of the model. Well, actually, what I can do is I can just delete this because here's my original that I was starting with, and now it's in the right location. I can just right click and make shop drawings. And sure enough, here's that collar tie joint that I just made. In case that wasn't clear, what I just did there was take advantage of the fact that this component and the one that I had out in space were the same component. So if you change one, you change them all. So I'd made all my edits out here, then I erased that one, came back to this one that was still in place, and used that for my test. So there's 2 examples of how you make your own joints from scratch. And you may be asking yourself, well, what about more complicated things like splines or through tenons? Well, I will get to those, but this video is getting a little long, so we'll save that for another day. That's all I have today from Tenon Tech. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and we'll see you next time. Take care.